Thanks for that nice introduction, Sarah. And I think I just made you co-host, so I'm hoping that you can continue monitoring to let people in if I miss anybody in the waiting room. And yeah, I hope that this can really be more of a conversation than a lecture. I am so excited. I was very excited when CK reached out and invited me to speak with this group because we are all about cross-pollination. Yeah, so please feel free to interrupt. You can raise your hand or just unmute yourself, or if you feel more comfortable just putting a note in the chat. I'll try to keep an eye on that. But yeah, Sarah, if you could just let me know if a question comes up, please feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so with that, yeah, thanks for having me and for joining me on this Wednesday morning, and apologies for some of the technical difficulties. Um, So yeah, and thanks for taking some time to learn a little bit about the migratory bird joint ventures and a little bit about why the Whidbey Basin is such an important area for migratory birds. And I'll end by talking a little bit about why we feel at the joint venture we really believe in the power of partnerships like this one, like the Sustainable Lands Strategy Partnership, for really moving the needle. I think these sort of collaborative partnerships are really critical for conservation moving forward. So I'm just delighted to be here. A little bit about me. I'm from Western Washington, so I grew up on a little island in the Puget Sound called Vashon Island. I went to school at University of Washington. I lived up in the North Cascades when both of my kids were born up near Diablo Lake. And we left the state for a while, but recently relocated back to Port Townsend up on the Olympic Peninsula a couple of years ago. So I really have spent most of my life in Western Washington, and I feel a pretty deep connection with the region. Um, I spent the better part of the last 17 or 18 years as a researcher, so really focusing on landscape ecology and impacts of land use and land cover change on wildlife. And I just recently pivoted more into conservation planning. And so I joined the joint venture just about a year ago, so I'm relatively new to the joint venture universe. Can you guys see my screen all right?
Yes. It looks good.
Okay. So the migratory bird joint ventures, I'd be kind of curious how many people have ever heard of the migratory bird joint ventures. Maybe you could raise your virtual hand. I know CK has. Great, thanks, Alan. A couple of others. So it's not uncommon for folks to not have really heard of the joint venture or to be that familiar with what we do. We sort of think of ourselves as maybe the coolest conservation network you may have never heard of, but it's great that some of you in this group have. I see your thumbs up. Thanks, Diane. So there are 24 migratory bird joint ventures across North America, in the US and Canada and parts of northern Mexico. Most of these, so 22 of them, are habitat focused, meaning we focus our efforts on protection and restoration of habitats, not on species specific priorities. There are 3 joint ventures that are species specific. All of these joint ventures have our roots in waterfowl and wetland conservation. That's because we really sort of were born out of the movement behind the North American Waterfowl Management Plan from the 80s, where essentially lots of duck hunters were noticing declining populations of waterfowl, and folks started digging into it, and they realized it was largely because of sort of widespread loss and degradation of wetlands, the wetland habitats that these waterfowl depend on, primarily in their breeding grounds. And so we started in I think 1986 with just 3 joint ventures sort of focusing on mid-continent wetlands. And because of that, all of the joint ventures still have really strong connections with waterfowl and wetland conservation. Having said that, in the late 90s, all of the joint ventures expanded our scopes to include all birds, which is a pretty tall order, especially because it didn't come with a corresponding increase in funding. The majority of our funds do come from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Migratory Bird Program. And at their heart, the joint ventures are really made up of voluntary collaborative partnerships with partners working to advance regional priorities to benefit birds, but also to benefit fish and other wildlife and people. So all of these joint ventures have some similarities. Again, our main priority and goal is to help facilitate and empower partnerships to protect and restore habitats for the benefit of birds, other wildlife, and for people. And all of the joint ventures are guided by these kind of foundational strategic plans. They're all either national, continental, or hemispheric, really large scale plans to guide these large scale bird conservation efforts, scaled down to local and regional efforts. And we have plans for the 4 major bird groups. So these include shorebirds, waterfowl, land birds, and water birds. Each of these joint ventures are also unique, mainly because, and it's sort of by design. So they're unique in their geographic extent. So our smallest joint venture is the San Francisco Bay joint venture, and it really just focuses on the San Francisco estuary. And that's sort of juxtaposed against the Intermountain West joint venture, which is the largest joint venture just to the east of us. They all differ in their staff capacity. So some of the joint ventures only have 1 staff person. Others have pretty large staffs with science coordinators and communication coordinators. Our joint venture in the Pacific Coast has 5 full-time staff. And they all differ in their legal status. So this is another thing that makes us kind of mysterious. Some of the joint ventures are actually their own 501c3 nonprofits. Others are still administered directly by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Many are administered by a separate nonprofit that acts as a parent agency or a fiscal sponsor. So that's the case for the Pacific Birds joint venture. Our fiscal sponsor is Ducks Unlimited, which is part of the reason why I know CK. And all of the joint ventures, because they're very regional in nature and region specific, they also differ in the sort of habitat priorities and key threats that they focus on. So again, the Intermountain West, for example, really focuses on sagebrush ecosystem conservation. I've included the logos of some of the other main joint ventures in the Pacific Flyway region. Another example is the Atlantic Coast joint venture, which is sort of our counterpart on the East Coast. And for example, they've decided to put all their eggs into salt marsh conservation. So even though their joint venture goes all the way from Maine to Florida, the habitat priority they focus all of their efforts on is salt marsh. And of course, all of the joint ventures differ in the regional partners that make up each joint venture. The migratory bird joint ventures are only as strong as the partners that participate. And collectively, the migratory bird joint ventures have protected a network of over 24 million acres of habitat, really thanks to our partners working together. All right, so our regional joint venture has a pretty large geographic extent. It runs from the northern coast of California up the Pacific coast in British Columbia, and in the early 2000s, we expanded to include the state of Alaska and all of the US Pacific Islands. So that's a pretty large footprint that includes a huge diversity of habitats and ecosystems. I think it covers like 30 degrees of latitude. And again, with only five full-time staff, we have gone through a process of sort of focusing on some specific priority habitats. So in our region, in the Pacific Islands, we really focus on Hawaiian wetland habitats. So I have a counterpart based in Hawaii who focuses only on that. On the continental side, we focus on oak and prairie habitat, really primarily in Oregon and the Willamette Valley and some parts of South Central Washington. But our largest priority by far is coastal wetlands. The reason coastal wetlands is such a big priority for us is that we just have a really large stewardship responsibility for coastal birds in our geography. So there's a lot of migratory shorebirds and waterfowl species that pass through our region that are really reliant on wetland habitats during multiple phases of their life cycles. And I included some pictures of a few different coastal wetland habitat types because within that broad umbrella of coastal wetlands, there are a few that we focus on because of their importance for birds. So we focus on eelgrass meadows, tidal wetlands, intertidal mudflats, and sand spits. That's essentially estuaries. Freshwater wetlands and lakes that are adjacent to estuaries in particular, and we include agricultural lands because of the importance of agricultural landscapes and floodplains for a lot of our waterfowl. And I just wanted to mention that as part of our partnership, one of the things we do is strategic planning with partners. And so we are currently in the process of developing and updating really our strategic conservation plan for coastal wetlands. We have an existing plan, but it's quite out of date. And so over the last year or two, we've been going through a process of working really closely with partners all across the region to really create a shared vision, essentially to make sure we're identifying the common threats and key strategies that we want to focus on to make sure we're all kind of rowing in the same direction. And the goal of this plan is to inform the work that we do at the joint venture, but also the work that our partners focus on, and ultimately to sort of help inform funders. So there's sort of two ways that can happen. The idea is that our partners can point to this region-wide plan as sort of justification for projects that they might be trying to get funding for. So they can say, this is a project that's not just important for our local landscape, it's been identified as a priority across the region. The other thing we can do is actually take the plan to our funding partners, who often are interested in learning how they can update the criteria that they use to rank proposals based on key conservation priorities, threats, and strategies. So this is just a little public service announcement that this planning process is underway. We're hoping to have a full draft plan for review this summer. And so it'd be wonderful if some folks from this group might be willing to take a look at the plan once it's drafted and offer us feedback. I'm happy to facilitate like a workshop or a presentation or even just one-on-one conversations. The idea being that we really want to make sure that the priorities that you're focused on are represented in this plan. So. All right. Again, so why focus on coastal wetlands for bird conservation in our region? A big piece of that is because the Pacific Flyway encompasses most of our geography. So the Pacific Flyway is one of 4 major North American migration routes for birds. And this is essentially a migratory superhighway that runs from the Alaskan Arctic all the way down to Patagonia, extending along the Pacific coast of Mexico, Central America, and South America. And each year, at least 1 billion birds migrate along the Pacific Flyway. And this is unfortunately only a fraction of the number of migratory birds that used this flyway about a century ago. And coastal wetlands in particular are these incredibly rich, productive environments that provide really critical resting, feeding, breeding, and wintering sites for millions of migrating birds in our region. And ultimately our goal is just to ensure that birds have a place to land and food to eat, to sustain them along these sort of ancestral journeys between their wintering grounds and where they go to breed in the far north. I think it's always worth sort of emphasizing that these birds provide a lot of economic and recreational opportunities through bird watching, hunting, and photography. Birds often are a vehicle to capture the interest of the public and engage people to watch and to care. And we know that what people care about and love and are invested in, they'll fight to protect. The bad news is that, like so many other species, birds are experiencing really unprecedented challenges and alarming declines at a global scale. So in 2019, this paper by Rosenberg came out, finding that we've lost roughly 2.9 billion birds over the last 50 years in the US and Canada alone. And birds that rely on coastal habitats are some that have been hardest hit and experience the highest proportional losses. I mean, especially birds overwintering in coastal regions and shorebirds. I think most of us that work in wildlife conservation and bird research weren't actually surprised by the findings in that report. We've seen and documented bird declines for decades. It's still a pretty big bummer to hear it put in those terms that we've lost 1 in 4 birds in the last 50, 60 years. But a lot of really dedicated, committed, smart people have been putting their heads together to think through how we can work and coordinate efforts at really large scales to try and slow these declines or even start to reverse some of them. And all of these continental scale plans are really stressing the importance of broad conservation partnerships, like the joint ventures and like the sustainable land strategy. I think partnerships like this are really well positioned to help promote and implement actions to try and reverse some of these species declines. We really believe that these types of collaborative efforts matter now more than ever. So, this is the last slide about the joint ventures. I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overview of our approach to conservation delivery. So we don't own any land as a joint venture. We don't have any regulatory decision-making power. Really, the niche that we fill is connecting partners with each other, connecting partners with funding sources. So the approach that we take is really working with partners to kind of establish a shared vision of what the primary goals are and the strategies, help partners organize at the scales that they work at. And oftentimes the biggest lift we provide is helping partners increase their capacity. A lot of times partners already know what they need to do. They just don't always have the staff or funding to do it. And so a big piece of what we do is try to connect our partners with funding sources. A lot of times if partners in different areas are working on the same sorts of projects, if they combine their efforts, they can often be eligible for larger pools of funding than they would be alone. And a big piece of what we do is helping partners navigate these two specific grants in particular. So you all may already be familiar with these, but the NACA grants are the North American Wetlands Conservation Act grants that are really focused on waterfowl conservation and acquisition, restoration, and enhancement of wetland habitats for the benefit of birds, but also other species. And then the National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Grants, which are similar. It's worth noting that the NACA grants, the maximum that you can apply for has recently gone up. So for the small grants, it's gone, I believe, from $100,000 to $250,000. And for the large grant, it's gone from $1 million to $3 million. Of course, that does mean you have to find more match to apply for these, but it's just worth noting that it might be more worth your time because of the increased limits on what you can apply for. The other thing that not everybody realizes is that the migratory bird joint ventures actually help to rank NACA proposals once they come through within our own regions. And so it really, we really recommend that you reach out to us as early as you can in the application phase to let us know as much as you can about your project, because it just helps us write better letters of support, essentially, when we rank your proposal, and we can really advocate for your project and the benefits for birds and wetlands. So I thought it would be helpful just to show sort of where we're focusing it. A lot of times people ask, what does that mean, coastal wetlands? How are you defining that? The way we've chosen to define it is really at a watershed scale. So the dark blue here essentially outlines all of the major Huc 8 level watersheds that drain directly into the Pacific Ocean or into major embayments like the Puget Sound. I've just zoomed in here on the right to Washington so you could sort of see the watersheds that we focus on. It's a lot of ground to cover. And we'll zoom in now on the Whidbey Basin, which is why I was invited here. I know that this area is near and dear to your hearts. So, as you know, the Whidbey Basin is located on the east side of the Puget Sound. It's located in the North Puget Lowlands Planning Ecoregion for waterfowl and shorebird conservation. It includes the Skagit, Snohomish, and Stillaguamish River watersheds and associated nearshore habitats. And again, this is just an area of really essential continental level importance for birds, for migratory birds in particular. So the Skagit is the largest watershed in the Puget Sound. It starts in Canada and drains into the Skagit Bay. And this river delta is ideal for agriculture. And the upper river valley is also a major destination for bald eagles in the winter. It's fun to go up there and check out all the eagles in December if you can stand the cold. The Stillaguamish, is the fifth largest freshwater system in the Puget Sound, and this flows from the Cascade foothills with two forks where they meet in Arlington before they split and flow separately into Port Susan Bay. And then here's the Snohomish River, which traverses some of the best farmland in Western Washington, with the majority of the watershed covered in forest land and wilderness. Possession Sound, where the Snohomish River meets the marine waters, is home to over 300 species of birds, as well as salmon, otters, and seals. And the Snohomish River Delta boasts some of the largest eelgrass beds in the Sound. Okay, so this region really encompasses this incredibly rich, diversity of really important wetland habitats for birds, but again, also for fish and other wildlife and for people. And it's this high concentration of agriculturally dominated floodplains, sort of wetlands on agricultural lands have functionally taken the place of naturally occurring early successional freshwater wetlands that migratory waterfowl depend on in Washington. And then you've got these agricultural floodplains adjacent to these incredibly productive estuarine habitats, which are important for a lot of shorebirds and other coastal birds. And it's this mosaic of really rich wetland habitats that makes this region so important for migratory birds. And again, just revisiting this picture of the Pacific Flyway, the Whidbey Basin here with this yellow star is, again, I just wanted to kind of emphasize how important it is as a stopover along this Pacific Flyway for birds traveling all the way from South America to the Arctic. And you know, we're right here in the middle, and millions of birds rely on this place each year between their breeding and wintering grounds. And it's interesting because the timing of when they need these habitats depends on the species and the weather that year, but it really is a vital stopover for birds that need to rest and refuel and prepare for the next leg of their journey. It's also a major destination in and of itself for a lot of snow geese and swans, which I'm sure you've seen in the winter. It provides really important resources for those species during the colder months. I guess I just wanted to point out a couple of important designations in the bird universe, at least, that this region has received, just to again highlight how important this is, not just locally, but regionally and even continentally. So the Greater Skagit and Stillaguamish deltas received WISRN status. So WISRN, it stands for the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, and it's kind of a big deal in the migratory bird universe to receive these designations. It was designated as a site of regional importance, which just means that it supports over 20,000 shorebirds annually. You know, and this isn't a complex of sort of tidally influenced marine wetlands, marshes, mud flats, and channels that support a really rich diversity of wildlife, including shorebirds. And it's unique in that it's right adjacent to these agricultural lands that provide really important roosting sites that shorebirds need to rest in when they're not foraging. So this site is among the most important estuaries in the Puget Sound for shorebirds. It's one of only 4 sites in Washington that supports more than 20,000 shorebirds annually. And, you know, in addition to shorebirds, this region also supports a lot of other wildlife. So, you know, tens of thousands of lesser snow geese, thousands of trumpeter and tundra swans, thousands of dabbling ducks, important nesting sites for a range of raptors and great blue herons, and 5 harbor seal haul-out sites. And I probably don't need to tell this group, the Delta also supports federally listed Chinook salmon and other salmon species. You know, similarly, I thought it was worth mentioning that there's a couple of areas that have also been designated as globally important bird areas. This is a conservation framework run by Audubon, and this is really just another designation for areas that have been identified as globally important for the conservation of specific bird populations. So the Samish and Swinomish Bay important bird area was identified because of its a variety of habitats that support large concentrations of seabirds, ducks, and geese, Padilla Bay also contains some of the most extensive eelgrass beds on the West Coast, upwards of 8,000 acres of eelgrass, which is really ideal habitat for Pacific brant. So Pacific brant eat eelgrass, and the entire global population of the Western high Arctic subspecies of brant is thought to winter just in Padilla Bay. And again, the mudflats provide really important wintering and migratory habitat for thousands of shorebirds, as well as dabbling ducks and raptors. And then the Skagit Bay IBA, important bird area, was designated for very similar reasons, primarily because it's so important for wintering populations of trumpeter and tundra swans, as well as lesser snow geese. And then the estuarine intertidal area and adjacent flatlands, again, support so many species of shorebirds, songbirds, ducks, and raptors. And again, it was designated, this overlaps with the Wizern area, the shorebird designation area, and that does support a lot of Dunlin and also Western sandpipers, which are pictured here. And I thought it was worth mentioning that, during spring migration, the Pacific birds region contains 95% of the global population of Western sandpipers. So again, this is a species that we feel a high level of stewardship responsibility for. I'm going to skip through here, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about purple martins. I wanted to tell at least one success story because I feel like sometimes these presentations can be kind of gloomy. So it's important to me to at least mention that there are some successes. So this is the purple martin. They are the largest swallow in North America, and these are aerial insectivores. So they catch insects in the air. And a fun fact about martins is that they also drink while they're in flight. So they'll fly over lakes or streams and they'll scoop up water as they're flying. And this is a species that has a really long and symbiotic relationship with humans. So they're very receptive to nesting in nest boxes. And Native Americans used to hang gourds. Actually, a lot of folks still do hang gourds to attract nesting martins, in part to help control insect populations. So sort of nature's insecticide. And this is kind of a fun species because they are really loyal to their nest sites. So they'll return to the same nest box year after year if it's maintained. So the western population of purple martins has never been as large as the eastern population of purple martins, but they used to be pretty common. There's reports of thousands of these swallows lining the power lines around Green Lake in Seattle. But in the 1900s, they experienced a pretty severe population crash to the point where they were pretty much extirpated from a lot of coastal areas where they used to be, including in British Columbia and Washington. They're not endangered, but they are listed as a Washington state species of concern and a species of greatest conservation need. But through the hard work and dedication of a small army of volunteers who have built and installed and monitored these nest boxes, the small population of purple martins in Western Washington is slowly increasing again. And so breeding pairs can now be found in these nest boxes at Port Susan Bay, Padilla Bay, Anacortes, and some other areas. And so this darker sort of iridescent purplish black looking bird is the male, and this lighter colored swallow is the female. All right, so I guess I just wanted to emphasize, that I was really excited to talk with this group because I think even though we look through the lens of migratory birds and you may be looking through other lenses, I think we're focused on a lot of the same things, which essentially is trying to support healthy estuaries and wetland ecosystems. And I think there's a lot of common ground among all these various groups who care about the same landscapes and waters, even if it's for different reasons. So I think it makes a lot of sense for us to be having these conversations. I was reading through the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Plan the other day, which a fish friend of mine sent me, and I was really pleased to see, so here's a quote from the Salmon Recovery Plan, which just talks about how a lot of watershed plans in the Puget Sound have identified estuary protection and restoration as a high priority. In large part because they're really productive nurseries for salmon, for juvenile fish. but that they also support large numbers of migrating birds. So I was really excited to see birds in this salmon plan. You know, and as most of you know, we've lost the majority of our estuarine habitats to various human developments, and a lot of threatened and endangered species in the Puget Sound rely on these nearshore and estuary habitats for at least some part of their life cycle. And so I just bolded this down at the bottom, that restoring estuarine habitats will result in significant benefits to a wide range of species. You know, and this is something that we think about a lot, is finding common ground. So in terms of, there's a lot of, I think, shared opportunities, but also shared threats. So all of us that live in Western Washington know that there's a lot of competition for these limited landscapes, and there's only so much real estate to accommodate all of these different diverse needs and uses. And so from a migratory bird perspective, you know, at a very high level, our main priorities for the Whidbey Basin in the North Puget Sound area is really trying to help support this really unique and important matrix of agriculturally dominated floodplains and estuaries and nearshore habitats, which I think probably aligns with the work that a lot of you do. So in terms of nearshore and estuarine habitats, you know, the key threats that we focus on are sea level rise or the coastal squeeze, with the idea being that as sea levels rise, you know, there's only so much room for them, for these marshes to migrate inland, and especially when they run into hardened shorelines and development. And then of course, threats to water quality and invasive species. It's worth mentioning that the Northwest CASC, so the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, which is housed at the University of Washington, picked this topic, picked sea level rise and coastal squeeze as the topic for their deep dive this year. So over the last spring, they've kind of been gathering folks that are really grappling with this issue to just sort of collect the best available science and stories, and to hear how different communities and groups are thinking about this issue, and maybe even coming up with some solutions. So I think in early June, there's actually going to be an in-person workshop where they're going to kind of gather all of this information, and there should be a report that comes out soon. So I'm kind of excited to see that, just in terms of seeing what the sort of best available science and best management practices are, because this is an issue that we're dealing with all up and down the Pacific coast, not just in Washington. And I think some of you may be involved in that deep dive. You know, and then in terms of the agriculturally dominated floodplains, I guess I just want to emphasize again that a lot of times there's a perception that conservationists want to remove all of the tide gates and all of the levees to restore natural tidal processes. And in some cases that is the case, but at least in this region and in many regions across the coast, we're also really interested in helping to sustain agricultural lands and to keep working lands working, to keep farmers farming, again, because we recognize that those landscapes are so critical for waterfowl, and they're also really important for, you know, our human communities and food security. So we do support farms where we can, and especially focusing on bird-friendly agriculture and bird-friendly crops. You know, I thought I would just, I'm almost finished here, but I thought I would include this sort of collage of headlines that I thought was really interesting and kind of inspiring to highlight the multiple benefits of protecting and recovering coastal wetlands, from shared benefits for birds and fish when we recover estuaries, to mitigating climate change through carbon storage and flood control. I really loved this, is from your website, this sort of banner talking about how you're trying to cultivate a place of integrity and common ground, recognizing that finding a balance between salmon recovery and agriculture hasn't always been possible, but that we have to walk in each other's shoes to understand our hopes and fears. And I just really love this. And I think that, you know, from the migratory bird conservation perspective, we have been walking a similar line in terms of trying to find a balance between bird conservation efforts, salmon recovery efforts, agriculture, and other priorities. And I really do think, though, that there is a lot of common ground, and then in the end, a lot of our underlying objectives are aligned. You know, I think even if we're in different boats, I think oftentimes we're rowing in the same direction. So I get very excited when I have opportunities to talk with groups like yours. And I hope that this would be the first conversation of others in terms of just sharing ideas and cross-pollinating. I recently met a woman named Yuki Rice, who I think is a new restoration ecologist at the Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group. And we talked for about an hour and a half. And we were just so excited because a lot of the things that we're focusing on a lot of our priorities are really the same. And so coming at it from both a bird and a fish perspective, I think in some cases can bolster all of our efforts. So that's really all I had. I had one last slide here, just again, to let folks know that we do have a very small partnership grants program. We have limited funds, and the maximum that you can apply for is $15,000, and most of the awards are $5,000 to $10,000. They're due in late June. But I wanted to encourage this group to check this out if you're interested. A lot of times what our partners use this for is sort of seed money to make space for bringing partners to a table, just talk through an issue, or to kind of catalyze a longer term or bigger scale project or effort. So with that, I'll stop and see if there's any questions or comments.
If anyone has questions or points that they'd like to discuss, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can put it in the chat. And CK from Ducks Unlimited is also here to answer questions.
From Snohomish County. I'm the salmon recovery coordinator for the Snohomish Basin. And so we have lots of projects that are in various stages of development and implementation. And so I guess I'm just curious, as we're building out sort of our stakeholder / partner communications plans and engagement processes and intentions, how do you see like Pacific Birds being involved in those? We talk to CK a lot, but should we be talking to you too, or?
I think CK is an amazing representative. I don't know that I would have anything to add that CK doesn't. The only thing I would add is that, we would be happy to participate if you feel like it would be helpful. Like, we're happy to come to workshops or presentations like this to offer feedback if you have a draft plan and you'd just like us to take a look at it through a migratory bird lens. I'm sure you get a lot of great feedback from CK already, but one thing that we might be able to add, because I work at this flyway scale, like I spent all spring visiting with partners from Alaska to Humboldt Bay, is that there might be some efforts going on that are really parallel to what you're working on in the Snohomish Basin. And I might just be able to help put you in touch with people that are thinking about very similar issues, even if it's in a different geographic space.
Yeah, and certainly something that comes to my mind is with all this federal infrastructure funding, we're certainly seeing an opportunity to really sort of catalyze and move things along a little bit quicker than we've been able to over the last 20 years. And so I think incorporating like multiple benefits or having, multiple voices at the table always helps us to do that well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're happy to be at the table if it's helpful to you. And we are also hearing that excitement up and down the coast. Excitement, but also some panic, because it's a lot of funding coming all at once. And there's only so many people to write all the grants. So we're also here to help add some capacity with grant support if it's ever needed.
Well, that's interesting to think about. Certainly the term that we've been using is excitified, or excited and terrified at the same time. So
that's perfect.
I imagine there might be some folks who would be interested in exploring the capacity that you just mentioned a little bit deeper. So
yeah, for sure. And I know a lot of our agency partners are going through the same excitified phase where they're trying to like double their staff capacity for the next few years just to help partners connect with these funds. And so I think people are being hired fast and furiously, and so connecting partners with those resources to make sure that there's support there when it is something else that we can help with.
Thanks.
Thank you. CK, do you have anything to add?
Can't quite hear you, CK.
Oh, yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Hey, Gretchen, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So maybe for Laura's edification, can you kind of talk about how much money is coming into the Stille and the Snohomish? Because we have the DNR, we have floodplains by design, we've got the NOAA restoration grant, or maybe not even money, but just the amount of different things that are coming this way.
Great question. Complicated answer. It's a lot. You know, we just got WDFW supported a $24 million ask through NOAA that we just received that supports projects both in the Stille and Snohomish and Skagit. We have Fish Passage federal money. We have NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, supporting our Thomas's Eddy project on the Snohomish River main stem. So that when we have $10 million coming in for floodplains by design in the Snohomish, and I'm forgetting how big the Stille grant is, but it's pretty big. And so there is a lot coming in. So hence the excitified type of thing. And you know, the great thing about these multi-benefit funding sources like the NOAA Transformational Habitat Grant or Floodplains by Design is there's room in there to support capacity. There's room in there to obviously support multi-benefit objectives, but there's also room to support projects at all levels of development. And so it's, you know, we're really looking at building a pipeline of projects from conceptual to construction throughout both watersheds. So it's
That
exciting.
is amazing.
Yeah.
That is
Yeah.
a lot of money.
Yeah.
That's a lot of millions.
Right.
You know, and it might be as something as small as just putting a line in there that, you know, you have some intention to monitor birds while you're doing all of this other monitoring for fish and things like that, you know, and there even is Audubon and Eco Studies Institute and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife just spent a lot of years kind of coming up with a very straightforward sampling protocol. I think it's called well, I can share it with this group later, but it's a monitoring framework for birds in the Puget Sound specifically for estuary restoration projects and areas. So it might even be as simple as just putting a line in there that that's something you're aware of and that maybe you could work with bird partners to try and implement that while you're doing all of the other work.
Yeah. Well, and you know, maybe that's a piece of work that actually isn't well funded is the monitoring piece. So how do we know how our projects are working after they're done? There's usually a short time frame that we can have funding for monitoring. And so, you know, that could be a future broader conversation as well.
Yeah, I agree. Nobody ever wants to monitor, to fund monitoring, but it's probably one of the more important things that we should be doing. So that is really central to our sort of strategic planning, is trying to help figure out where we can drum up some more funding to monitor whether or not these things are having the results that we think they will.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And if they're not, then being able to adaptively manage for those. So yeah, it's an ongoing conversation as well. But certainly we're kind of focused on implementation. I know I saw Alan from Pilchuck Audubon was on earlier, and Martha Jordan is on. And so I feel like our local bird enthusiast communities have been pretty involved in some of our project development too. It's been super helpful, especially with some fund sources to be able to supply letters of support from those organizations and engage them in the design process. So yeah, and CK, as far as like the funding goes, I do think there's some SLS efforts underway to try and come up with like to help explain the story of everything that's happening and the magnitude of what's happening. I know Morgan's been involved in those conversations, so hopefully we'll have something a little bit more like polished to share at some point besides, oh my god, it's a lot. Yeah,
I can chime in there that the communications group has been working on a
Yeah. Okay.
communication strategy around funding specifically for the Snohomish Basin, and we're still working on it, but hopefully we'll be able to pass something along soon here.
Yeah. Good. Well, thanks a bunch. I have to jump to another meeting. Yeah.
Thanks for taking time.
Yeah. Nice to meet you, Laura. See you around.
Likewise. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm seeing comments in the chat about monitoring funding being a perennial problem.
Valerie, I saw you put your video on. Do you have a question for Laura or CK?
I mainly just wanted to say thank you. I'm glad that I've had a lot of frustrating technology issues this week, so I'm glad I was able to get most of your presentation and find the right link to join the meeting. I just wanted to say thank you. I've lived in the Upper Skagit, and I've been an enthusiast for the type of work you're doing, as well as what SLS and our teams are involved in. So thank you for being here today and for all the good
Yeah.
work.
Thanks for taking time to join. I wish I could have had a little more time to like meet everybody that was on the call. I guess I'll just have to start coming to more SLS meetings.
I'm curious to hear from maybe both Laura and CK about any current or upcoming efforts that you're particularly excited about in your work.
Upcoming projects you wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I guess we got a couple projects with the floodplains by design, which are going to be agricultural water management type projects. So I'm really excited about that, and specifically in the Snohomish Basin. We just finished a project up in the Samish, which is really cool. That also is an ag drainage project. Marty, who's on the call, is going to be helping us with WSU do some water quality monitoring to basically see the effects of that project. And just visually this winter, it was pretty amazing. We were able to hold water on the farm field. It was a potato field in the spring or in the winter, and then drain it off the spring so the farmer could get on. And we held like almost a foot of soil back from getting into the slough. The farmer was able to put back in his farm field, and now that'll be in hay for a couple of years. So it's a really good project. And then down in the Chehalis, we have a couple big acquisitions. We're putting a NACA together this month for 11 sites, 1,500 acres, a couple big estuary acquisitions for eventual restoration. So right now, Ducks Unlimited is primarily working here in the Snohomish and the Skagit, and then down in Grace Harbor, Chehalis, Willapa Bay. So that's kind of what's on my docket right now. Lots of little projects all over the place, but really is that farm plumbing and estuary restoration, trying to maintain that mosaic that Laura was talking about.
Sound like really exciting projects, CK. There was one project that I'll mention. I know we're almost out of time, but I'll just really quickly mention that the joint venture has been partnering with some of the National Estuarine Research Reserves, the NOAA Research Reserves. We've been working with 4 of the reserves in the Pacific region. So there's the one at South Slough in Oregon in Coos Bay. There's the one at Padilla Bay in Washington. There's one in Kachemak Bay in southern Alaska. And then there's one in Hei'eia in Hawaii. And it's basically a 1-year grant that we applied for to work together to essentially just talk about ways that we can do a better job of integrating traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous science into Western science through the lens of estuary stewardship, and especially focusing on culturally significant migratory birds. So it would be an exciting project. It's 1 year of funding that can be used to kind of catalyze more years of funding down the road. It's essentially to kind of build a team and start putting your ideas together. We'll find out in a few weeks if we receive that funding, but it's looking really promising. So if folks are interested in that topic, please feel free to reach out to me, because I think it'll be a really exciting effort that'll be going on for a few years. So hopefully there'll be lots of opportunities for involvement, both from our tribal partners and from conservation and local partners.